Hi all, Dr. Clark here again, and today for Fish and Wildlife Management, I'm going to talk about the influential individuals, or at least a couple of them, in which today's fish and wildlife managers, whether they belong to the fisheries unit, the wildlife unit, the non-game unit, we owe respect and a great deal of gratitude to these individuals for kind of paving the way for fish and wildlife management. Okay. So let's jump into a couple of these individuals. First off is Alexander Wilson. And some of you might have heard of Alexander Wilson. Um, there are journals and books named after Wilson. Wilson was an ornithologist, okay, that lived in the late 1700s, early 1800s. He's sometimes known as the father of ornithology. Remember, ornithology is the study of birds, right? And there's a journal called the Wilson's Bulletin, and that was named after Alexander Wilson. And really, his work, his early work, was to document diversity. Okay? And on top of just not just documenting diversity, documenting the decrease in diversity in different parts of the world and the United States. The Wilson Bulletin, this journal, publishes not just ornithological articles, but it also it publishes a lot on illustrations or new species information, that kind of stuff. So, and that really comes at Alexander Wilson's kind of background. He's a naturalist, and the term naturalist really means that today we would call him an ecologist. Okay, so he looked at living organisms in their natural habitat. He examined how they interact with other species, where you would find these organisms, etc. And so remember that Charles Darwin came up with a theory of evolution in the mid 1800s. Okay? So Alexander Wilson, even before Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection, Wilson's ideas and ideology were things that people like Charles Darwin could use that information as kind of a stepping stone into scientific research. Okay? Most of you have probably heard of the Audubon Society, or different regions, maybe a wetland that's called John James Audubon or Audubon Wetlands or Audubon Lake. Okay? And that's named mainly from this individual, John James. Again, late 1700s, early 1800s was most of his work. He was also an ornithologist and followed in the footsteps of Wilson. And he, just like Wilson, was into the artistic interpretation of nature. So he was a naturalist also. Okay, so we call him an ecologist. And Wilson was excellent at illustrating birds, mainly birds, but other things, plants and animals or mammals and some insects and a few reptiles and amphibians. James John James Audubon was very similar to Wilson in a lot of avenues, except for he was a painter and he made outstanding paintings of like large flocks of geese and ducks and things like that, and really attracted a lot of attention to the middle part of the United States. This is why we have things like the Audubon Society, which concentrates on wetland management and things like that, because a lot of Audubon's work was done in the Midwest before we decided to drain the wetlands and dam the rivers, etc. He he was painting and describing the natural habitat in these regions. One that I'm sure you probably have not heard of, unless you've had a course from me, is Konstantin Levinski. Konstantin Levinski is best known for giving a scientific name to a unicorn. Okay, but if you dive into his actual science or actual scientific background, while Audubon and Wilson were documenting wild places and wild things, they were doing it by drawing pictures of them or paintings and really attracting a lot of attention from the art point of view. Levinski, he was concentrating mainly on science. Now, I know some people would say, oh, but he named a unicorn, gave the unicorn a scientific name. Well, Levinski, not all of his scientific names are the result of him actually seeing the species. So people like Audubon or Wilson would give him a drawing and a description of the organism, and then he would name them scientifically. He was a zoologist, a little bit different. So he didn't just study birds, he studied everything. And zoology at this time was, I would probably say 90% was mammalogy. So as a zoologist in the late 1700s, early 1800s, was not concerned with fish. Okay? Fish were thought to be lower creatures, food for other things, and so a zoologist in this case, mainly he was interested in mammals. But the interesting part of that is a lot of the mammals had already been named. So what Levinski did is he named plants that the animals ate. Okay, and I mean he named 6,700 plant species, and today 99% of those plant species names stand today. Okay, I mean he had a huge body of work, but again, most people remember him for one kind of blunder, major blunder, and that was someone gave him a drawing of a unicorn. It was, extremely detailed, and he provided a scientific name for that mythical creature. And so that really kind of tainted his, his the scientific view of him. But I think people are moving past that. He gets credit for naming mule deer, so Odocoleus hemionus, and that's the scientific name for mule deer. And Levinski named that, described mule deer, described feeding patterns in mule deer, etc. So he was an early zoologist, and made trips into regions that no one else did to study plants and mammals and things like that. So he really did pave the way for ecologists. So again, he was a zoologist. Most zoologists up to this point, they're only studying the animals. They weren't studying what the animals eat or what the animals interact with. If you're a zoologist, you study animals. Well, Levinski was a little bit different in the sense that he felt, hey, the plants are just as important as the animals. And if we don't know what the plant is called, then it's pretty difficult to describe what the animal is consuming from a dietary point of view, or what the animal is using for nesting habitat, or as a refuge from predators, etc. Okay, so the three amigos, although one could say they were once all extremely good friends, and then afterwards they had issues with each other. These three should be given probably the most credit for the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and then any branch that really comes of that, whether that be state game or state forest or state BLM, those kind of things. And it was because they viewed the land more than just a resource that we should take. Okay, so I guess I'll start with John Muir because his views were more drastic and much more different than Roosevelt and Pinchot. John Muir, most of you have probably heard of him as the Muir Trail or Muir Pass, and there's a lot of places. There's even towns and mountain passes. If you ever make it to Mount Rainier and you climb halfway up Mount Rainier, it's called Muir Pass or Camp Muir, and this is really all because of John Muir and his work in the western United States. Well, it wasn't always that way. He was actually born in Indianapolis, and John Muir was born and he fled the country to get away from being made to go to war or drafted to go to war. So he fled the country, went to Canada. He worked in a sawmill in Canada until the threat of war was over, and then he came back. He hiked or walked, I guess you could say, from Indianapolis all the way to Florida, and then he took a ship from Florida to California. Okay? Now remember, the West during this time is not really established, and there's not even many of the places in the West weren't even states at this time. So he got to California, and he set his roots in what is now called Yosemite. And during the time, you could really just stake land, and that's exactly what John Muir did. He found a little piece of land, he claimed it, he built his own cabin on that land, and established himself there. Okay. Now, I should back up a little bit, because John Muir went to college. He went to college at the University of Wisconsin. And while there, he would be considered today, I guess, by college terms, to be a wanderer or an individual that's indecisive. John Muir never finished a degree, but he took classes in a lot of different things. He liked rocks, so he took geology. He liked animals and plants, so he took different biology classes. He liked poetry, so he took poetry classes. And he just dabbled in a bunch of different things, never compiling enough classes to ever get a degree, but compiling enough knowledge that when he was in California, he could start doing things that no one else had done. Okay? And so most people look at Muir and read Muir's work as he was a poet and he'd write about nature. But Muir was more than that. He actually published many articles, scientific articles, on things like the Sequoia Belt, on earthquakes in California, on the San Andreas fault line, lots of different things. He published many scientific articles without a degree and without a formal education in how to do so. He just went out and collected good data and published this material for everyone. Okay. So that's kind of the story of John Muir, and I will talk more about his interactions with the other two men. Most of you know something about Theodore Roosevelt. I'm not going to say too much about him, except for he was president of the United States. He was an avid hunter, and he appointed Gifford Pinchot to the U.S. Forest Service. Okay? So Gifford Pinchot became the first chief of the United States Forest Service. Okay? Pinchot was trained in forestry and had an idea about natural resources, logging, grazing, and these kind of things. And Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot were friends. Okay? Well, after Pinchot was appointed as the first chief of the Forest Service. John Muir and Pinchot became associated with each other. And at first, the relationship was great because both men felt that they're doing the right thing together in protecting the United States forest lands and doing what was best for the United States. Because we had already, by this point, we basically already clear cut in all of the eastern United States, and we are on our way to the western part of the United States to cut all the trees down again by the time Theodore Roosevelt became president and started protecting the land. Gifford Pinchot was such an influence in that he bought up tons of land. And I mean, his first couple years as the chief of the Forest Service, he really, that's what he did. That's what his goal was to buy the land and protect the land from people establishing on it or cutting it down, grazing on it, etc. The falling out between Muir and Pinchot, and maybe Muir versus Roosevelt and Pinchot, was when Pinchot decided to allow sheep to graze on U.S. forest land. Okay? Now, some of you might have heard the term mountain maggots or prairie maggots. That term is ancient. That term was actually coined or thought up by John Muir in describing the scene of sheep on a mountain from a far distance. It looked like little white maggots and that were just eating away the entire landscape. And so John Muir hated Gifford Pinchot for allowing sheep to graze on Forest Service land. Pinchot, many of you might know the term for the greater good, for the greater number. That's kind of the motto of the U.S. Forest Service, the BLM, and even Game and Fish. That was really Gifford Pinchot's idea with natural resources, that we should allow for the natural resource to be sustained so future generations can have it, but we also shouldn't preserve it. We should conserve it. John Muir is a preservationist. He thought everything should be a national park and you should not take anything from it. And Gifford Pinchot thought everything should be government land and you should apply for permits, etc., in order to use the land. But, ultimately the government would be overseeing it so that future generations would have that resource. And that's kind of, where we get the national park system. And that's, kind of John Muir's motto. And then the Forest Service, Game and Fish, National Wildlife Refuges, BLM, that's all kind of Pinchot's model. Okay. Wilderness areas are kind of a mix of both. And wilderness areas, I'll talk about the individual that kind of gave rise, kind of spearheaded that. Before I get to him, we can't forget about fish. So up to this point, really, no one's talking about fisheries. And probably the most influential individual in fisheries is a guy named David Starr Jordan. Okay, and so in the mid 1800s into the 1900s, David Starr Jordan realized that a lot of the United States fisheries, a lot of fisheries around the world, were in deep trouble. Okay? He was an ichthyologist, so he studied fish, and he is credited with numerous species, the naming of numerous species. You'll see if you know much about naming that Jordan is after a bunch of species, and that was due to his credit. He wanted to catalog the diversity of fish in the world, and so he set out to do that. But on top of that, he also set out to talk about the importance of habitat and the importance of the ecology of these streams. And then he might be fairly notable for his comments in regards to war. Okay, and so this is one of his comments that is often used by people when they discuss the detriment of war, and that was that war is detrimental to the human species because it removes the strongest organisms from the gene pool. Right? And it's interesting to think, and most people don't realize this, but David Starr Jordan in the late 1800s, he was thinking about gene pools before we even knew there was such thing as a gene pool. Before we knew there was such thing as genetics, chromosomes, DNA, David Starr Jordan was thinking about, hey, you remove the strong, the fit, and what you get is a weak gene pool. So 31 species of fish is credited to David Starr Jordan directly, all in the United States, most of them in the western part of the United States, although he does have some darter species and things like that that he's credited for the eastern part of the United States. All right, the man that we owe all the credit basically for wilderness areas is this guy, Aldo Leopold. Most of you have probably heard of Aldo Leopold. He's a ecologist. He started off at the Forest Service, and he started off as one of the first classes to graduate college to become a forester, and did so from Yale. So from the late 1800s, the mid 1900s is when Leopold did his work. Again, he's an ecologist, and I guess you could say he was one of the first environmentalists. Okay, but environmentalist often gets a negative, it seems to be a negative term. Like, environmentalists are preventing the cutting of trees or the taking of animals, etc. I just want to make sure that you understand that Aldo Leopold was the individual that wrote the very first game management textbook. He was an avid hunter. He was an avid fisherman. He harvested many trees. Okay? His point of view, from an environmentalist point, was that if you take it off the landscape, you should put it back on the landscape. So not only did he cut trees for firewood and building of houses and cabins and things like that, he also planted thousands of trees, okay, to give back to the community, to give back to the ecological community what he took. Okay? And so I think when people think about environmentalists, they think negatively of them. But Aldo Leopold was one of those spearheaders, the environmental movement. But he was approaching it from a scientific point of view, not a political or economic point of view. He wrote something called The Land Ethic. And if you haven't read Sand County Almanac, I highly suggest that you read Sand County Almanac. It's an excellent book for individuals to read about ecology, environmentalism, and what is considered the land ethic. Okay? And then, like I said, he started the Wilderness Act, okay, and wrote the very first game management textbook. He was a professor at the University of Wisconsin, and died of a heart attack in 1948. Okay. Another one that many of you may not know, and we lost Stephen Jay Gould early on in his career. He wasn't very old when he passed away from pancreatic cancer. But Stephen Jay Gould, you could say, spearheaded the genetic movement, spearheaded the use of genetics, the use of molecular techniques in fields like fisheries management, wildlife management. Okay? And so he played a really important role in bridging the gap between game agencies and what you would consider scientific researchers. Okay? He bridged that gap to try to get individuals to realize, hey, some of these techniques are really useful in game management. Okay? And so he died in 2002. He's what we call an evolutionary biologist. He used a lot of genetic techniques, but he also wrote about the connection between plants and animals from an evolutionary point of view, and kind of drove a lot of policy when it came to forest service, when it came to clear cutting, the interactions between species, etc. Right? He's also known for punctuated equilibrium, and that sometimes species, you have an explosion of species or speciation events, right, versus just gradual evolution. Sometimes you can have these big explosions, and that kind of drove a lot of wildlife managers to understand, hey, what happens if we introduce a species into a population? We could have a huge extinction, or we could have a bunch of species changing to adapt to that new individual. Ontogeny and phylogeny. Okay, so he was influential in looking at larval fishes and what happens to larval fish in hatcheries, rivers, lakes, what's going on with the environment. So you might have a great genetic stock, but if you're introducing these fish fry or really anything, juvenile birds, whatever it might be, into a habitat that's not advantageous, it's not a good habitat, then it's not all about the genetics. Okay? That environment can have a huge role in driving the outcome of that organism. And so a lot of his work is used now in hatcheries and things like that to think about genetic stock, the environment, what's going to happen when you release these, and what to look for if they come back and they're stunted or something like that, what's going on. Robert MacArthur, another ecologist that we lost really early. I think he died when he was like 42. 42. A huge component of examining entire ecosystems. Instead of looking at a single species that we're interested in, like a rainbow trout or a mule deer, we need to look at the interactions between species, the competition, the plant community, etc. And he wrote a lot about it. He's a population ecologist. Okay? He talked about optimal foraging, which is allowed for us to think about the amount of nutrients an organism needs, okay? What kind of habitat requirements those organisms need, okay? How it is that you can have multiple organisms that might consume the same thing, occupy the same place, okay? And that they will forage optimally so they don't interact with each other. They reduce the competition, the niche competition between organisms. He's also hugely influential in bio-island geography. And so any management agency that's after management on islands, they all know MacArthur's work because he did a lot of island work. And islands are a whole different ball game than mainlands, except for when mainland communities or mainland practices make islands. And this is where he drew a lot of the connection between the two. When you clear cut a region and you leave one patch of forest but barren landscape around it, you've created an island. And you have to manage that island of forest like an island with oceans all around it and species that can't swim. Because a lot of species can't cross those barren areas without being predated on, or they might just not be able to cross it, period, or they're not going to. They never leave that forested habitat. So MacArthur made those connections like, hey, islands, they're very specific. They have very unique systems, but we can do the exact same thing, and we've done the exact same thing on mainlands. Right? And the last one I want to talk about is E.O. Wilson or Edward Wilson. He's still alive today, still hugely influential. And the reason why I say he's um, one of the more influential individuals when it comes to fish and wildlife management is, I would say, before Edward Wilson, we didn't think about these things. These are ants. We didn't think about insects. So we managed an ecosystem. We knew plants were important. We knew the mammals, the fish were important, even the amphibians and the reptiles and the birds. We knew they were important. But until E.O. Wilson started examining biodiversity and examining regions where we were managing for something, okay, maybe we're managing for elk populations, and he examined these or people associated with him examined these, and they realized that not only by managing against wolves, removing wolves from the landscape, are you affecting the elk, you're also affecting the insect communities. And when you affect the insect communities, those are the pollinators. And when you affect the pollinators, now you affect the plant community, which in return affects the organisms that are eating the plants or the elk that you're trying to manage. And so Edward Wilson wrote lots of books about biodiversity, has done tons of work in the tropics, etc., classifying organisms and documenting the decline of biodiversity across the world, and is very influential in a lot of communities, whether that be Forest Service or Fish and Wildlife. His work has really spearheaded a lot of management efforts to bring back native species to streams, native plant communities, etc. Okay? And so a lot of books on biodiversity. The Diversity of Life is probably his most famous book. Excellent book if you haven't read it. Okay, with that, those are just a few of the individuals that I think are very influential in fisheries and wildlife management. As we progress, I'll talk about a lot more. I'll talk about individuals that single-handedly saved endangered species. I'll talk about individuals that have changed the way we hunt and fish and changed the way that we think about landscapes. But those individuals that I just mentioned, they kind of paved the way for these new guys that I'm going to talk about in the future. Okay, so with that, I will